Relax and listen to the voice. Ho 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 ho. Oh ho 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 ho. Merry Christmas and welcome to the 2024 edition of Xmas Horror Stories. Here we go. There was once a little girl who had a large collection of dolls. One Christmas, she saw a doll in the window of a department store that she absolutely had to have. The doll had long, flowing blonde hair and a lovely blue dress. But the thing that impressed her most about the doll was that it had lovely, bold, purple fingernails. When Christmas morning came, she was delighted to find the doll with the purple fingernails lying under the Christmas tree. She played with it all day, and when she went to sleep, she put it on the table at her bedside. That night, the little girl was awakened by strange noises. It was still dark outside. She looked all over for her doll, but it was nowhere to be found. The girl, puzzled, got out of bed and walked into the hallway. The door to her parents' room was ajar, and she pushed it open softly and looked in. Her parents appeared to be sleeping soundly, so she went back to bed. In the morning, she saw that the doll with the purple fingernails was sitting on the table by her bed, exactly where she had left it. She assumed that she must have just been having some kind of bad dream or maybe even sleepwalking. But when she went into her parents' room that morning, she found them both lying dead in a pool of blood. There were two purple doll's fingernails stabbed into their hearts. It was Christmas Eve, and an 11-year-old French girl named Juliette was decorating the Christmas tree. Her mother was working as a nurse at the local hospital, and the two of them lived alone in this small apartment in the suburbs of Paris. Late that evening, Juliette's mother called to say that she would not be home until even later on that night. Juliette continued to decorate the tree with all of the lovely things that her mother had bought at the shop. She draped some multicolored Christmas lights around the Christmas tree and hung beautiful ornaments on the branches. After placing the angel on the top of the Christmas tree, she finally finished decorating and sat down to relax and watch TV. Even though she was all alone in the 6th-floor apartment, Juliette felt safe as she gazed out across the lights of the Parisian skyline. From her window, she could see the Eiffel Tower and the Champs de Mars. Most of the other tenants in the building had gone home to spend Christmas Eve with their relatives in the countryside. The apartment building was almost deserted. Juliette was growing bored waiting for her mother to return. Suddenly, she thought she heard a scratching noise at the front door. She turned down the television and listened carefully, and there was an eerie silence. Curious, she slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole. To her surprise, she saw a man standing outside, dressed in a red suit with a fluffy white trim. He was large and fat with a dirty gray beard and wore a red hat on his head. And just then, he knocked at the door quite loudly. Nervous and concerned, she asked through the door, "Who's there?" "It's Santa Claus," the man replied. "Let me in. I'm cold and I'm tired and I'm hungry." At this, a chill went down Juliette's spine. She was no dummy. She knew that, whoever this creepy man was, he wasn't Santa Claus. My mother isn't home right now," she said, her voice shaking. "Please leave." Peering through the peephole, Juliet watched as the man's eyes filled with anger and his face twisted into a grimace of hate. He began knocking at the door even harder and rattling the doorknob. "It's Santa Claus, Juliet," he growled. "Have you laid out some milk and cookies for me, Juliet? You know how much Santa loves his milk and cookies." The young girl had a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. How did he know her name? Then the man began kicking and pounding at the door. She peeked out again and saw him reach into his coat pocket and pull out a switchblade. He shoved the knife into the keyhole and tried to pry it open. Juliet was terrified. She didn't know what to do. "If you don't go away, I'll call the police," she shouted. All of a sudden, the knocking stopped. Juliet stood perfectly still, afraid to move. Minutes passed, and she started to think that the man might have been scared away by her threat. She slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole to see if the man was really gone. The hallway seemed to be empty. Suddenly she saw the man running down the hallway with an axe in his hand. Juliet screamed and ran to the closet in a panic. She crouched down and hid behind the coats as tears of fright rolled down her cheeks. She heard boom, boom, boom as the man tried to smash down her front door. There was a mighty crack as the door gave away, and the man came crashing through the splintered wood. Laughing to himself, he called out, "Juliet, my pretty, where are you, Juliet? Don't be afraid. We'll have ourselves some fun tonight. Where are you hiding?" The crazed intruder walked around the house, searching for the frightened girl. Juliet curled up in the closet, trembling with fear. She dreaded to think of what the man had planned to do with her. Suddenly the handle on the closet moved up and down. Then the door began shaking, and she heard the man's voice, once again laughing. "Juliet, I know you're in there. Open up for Santa. Open up. Ho, 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 before I open you up." The man swung his axe, and it struck the closet door with a huge bang, tearing into the flimsy wood. Juliet screamed and began crying bitterly. She grabbed a wire coat hanger and twisted it into a point. She waited, her eyes wide open, and her hands were trembling. There was another loud crash, and the closet doors gave way in a hail of splinters. The horrible man tore the doors off of their hinges and thrust his head in between the coats. He was laughing and drooling like a madman as his huge, gnarled hands grabbed at the horrified girl. Juliet held up the pointed end of the coat hanger and bravely thrust it into the man's face. The twisted, pointed hanger went straight into one of his eyes. The man recoiled in pain, screaming with rage as blood flowed down his cheek. He ripped the wire coat hanger out of his eye socket and grabbed Juliet by the hair. Then he dragged her, kicking and screaming, out of the closet. The man pushed her to the ground and held her tightly by the neck, leaning over her. Blood spilled out of his eye, splattering all over her face. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and he whispered in her ear, "Tonight you will be privileged, my lovely Juliet. I've got a list, and I've checked it twice. I'm here to decide if you've been naughty or nice. You can scream and beg for your life, but naughty girls get the axe, and nice girls get the knife." Ho, 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 ho. It was after midnight when Juliet's mother returned home. She saw the front door, hacked to pieces, and rushed inside to look for her daughter. Gazing around at the carnage, Her eyes struggled to take it all in. Then she began screaming in absolute horror. The Christmas tree, which she saw bright and decorated, was also decorated with Juliet's entrails, and her severed head was perched at the top of the tree. My mom and my sister were never very nice to me. My mom preferred my sister over me and spoiled her rotten. My mom usually spent all my dad's money getting her everything she wanted for Christmas and got me nothing. Well, I did get stuff from my other relatives. It didn't make me ignore how my mom and sister treated me. Being a spoiled rotten 5-year-old, my sister delighted in making fun of me, calling me every name in the book and telling me how my mother loved her and hated me. This Christmas, I didn't ask Santa for any presents. I asked him to grant my Christmas wish. I wanted a new mom and a new sister. We lived in Ohio and our relatives all lived in Pennsylvania, so we left in the early morning on Christmas Eve because of snow and holiday traveling, and usually got there in the early night hours. However, this time we left around noon, and my mom was yelling at my dad the whole time. She'd been threatening to leave him lately and to take my sister with her. It was getting dark and too late to be driving, so we got off at the nearest exit and parked our car at a designated parking lot and walked through this Victorian-style town, appropriately named Dickenstown, Pennsylvania. It was as if we'd fallen into the pages of a Christmas carol. Horse-drawn carriages and sleighs lined the streets. The houses were all built together, like townhouses in London, and the people were all dressed in 1800s-era clothing. All the buildings had wreaths on them and candles lighting the windows. Some carolers were standing in the town square, singing "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." It had a Victorian-style clock tower and gazebo. An older-looking church, the kind with just one room, much like the older schoolhouses, was just finishing its service, and silent night could be heard from inside. After my mom and sister kept complaining about my dad and I admiring the scenery, we pulled to a fancy 19th century looking inn, appropriately named the Old Victorian Inn. It had a stone gravel lot, in keeping with the old-style look of the town. A trio of street performers were using trombones to play "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen." We entered the lobby through a wooden door, also with a wreath on it, and approached the owner and manager, Pam. She and Dad had quite a nice conversation. She even let us get a room at half price, it being Christmas and all. She introduced her children, Jeremy, a 7-year-old like me, and Angela, the sweetest little girl ever. Dad let me play with them while my mom and sister went to our room. Dad and Pam continued their conversation, and Pam told him that her husband had passed earlier this year, and she hadn't been able to get them much for Christmas, as running the inn was hard enough without him. They stopped, and Dad and I got a chance to admire the lobby. With a Christmas tree in the corner, old-style decorations and ornaments, a village that was a replica of Dickenstown in the window, candles in the other window, and a chimney in the corner adjacent to the Christmas tree, with garland and stockings hanging from it, holding within it a blaring fire and rocking chairs sitting in front. Pam then motioned to the man playing the piano in the corner and asked if we had any requests for him. We asked him to play "O Little Town of Bethlehem." Pam then offered to bring us hot chocolate, and we both said yes. Dad complimented Pam on everything, and she explained that she owned the wagons and sleighs seen in the town. The wagons were for the citizens, while the sleighs were for the tourists, and the band outside worked for her. She would have the carriage take them home in an hour, and she said that the wagons and sleighs took people to the special parking lot outside of this special part of town, where we were parked, so they could drive home. She offered to get us a sleigh ride the last of the night, and we accepted. I asked if her kids could come with us, and she said that would be okay. We got back, thanked Pam for everything, said goodnight to her and her children, and then joined my mom and sister in our room. They were complaining about everything. No TV, no pool, no hot tub, etc., etc. Apparently, they had been harassing the employees while Dad and I were talking with Pam and her kids, as well as when we were on the sleigh ride. We all went to bed as we had to get up early to leave. We went to sleep, my mom and my sister in one bed, Dad and I in the other. I awoke in the early morning hours to the sound of sleigh bells. At first, I thought this was one of Pam's sleighs, but then I remembered that she had went home and wouldn't run her sleighs this late anyway, as we had ridden in the last one. Besides, these came from above us. I thought I was just imagining them, and then I heard a thud on the roof, followed by what sounded like hoof prints, and another thud of what sounded like boots. I heard this boot sound walking on the roof, and then fade, and then heard them coming up the wooden steps and stop at our door. The door swung open, and a big man in a Santa suit walked in, complete with a beard. I closed my eyes, keeping one slightly open to see what the man was doing. He grabbed my mom and stuffed her in a sack, and then walked over to my sister, who had been startled awake by the sound of his boots. In a deep Darth Vader type of voice, he said, "You've been naughty," and picked her up, stuffing her into the sack with my mom. Then he turned and walked out of the room. My eyes were completely shut at this point, and I was just listening to the sound of his boots as they faded away. I was already awake by the time my dad woke up. He was a little confused and upset, but he just assumed that my mom and sister had left him, and he said that they had probably called a cab to take them back home, so they could get all their stuff. When I tried to tell him about what happened, he wouldn't believe my story about the man in the Santa suit. He told all of this to Pam, who consoled him, and then she gave him her number in case he ever needed anything. Around New Year's, he called Pam and asked if they could meet. After going through whatever proceeding he had to go through in order to divorce his missing wife, he started dating Pam, and then he asked her to marry him on Christmas Eve the very next year, which was just after they had met. To celebrate, they had the wedding the very next day. I didn't even ask Santa for anything else that year. He had already given me everything that I wanted. It was Christmas Eve, and the family were gathered in the living room. The father was reading the newspaper, and the mother was knitting a sweater. The children, Jimbo and Steffa, were stretched out on the floor with their crayons and their coloring books. "Tell us a story," Steffa demanded. "Yeah, a scary one," Jimbo insisted. "All right," said the father. "I'm going to tell you about the most fearsome, dangerous, and appalling creature in the world, and it's called the Grither." "Oh, now you've done it," said their mother. "You said his name out loud." "Who is he?" asked Jimbo. "He's the most awful thing in the world," their father said. "He lives in a cave at the North Pole. The coldest, wettest place on Earth is where the Grither makes his home. He sleeps in the wreck of a ship that somehow got squeezed into the mouth of a cave. He doesn't mind the cold, and he doesn't mind the wet, but the thing he hates most of all is to hear someone say his name. He has very good ears, and they get bigger every time his name is spoken anywhere on Earth. Sometimes his ears get so big he can use them to fly." "I don't like this story," Steffa whined. It's too late now, her mother said. We've already mentioned his name. The Grither is probably on his way to our house this very minute. It will probably take him a while to get here, said their father. If we finish the story before he gets here, everything will be fine. Do you know why the Grither is called the Grither? Why? The children asked. Because he has fists as big as basketballs and arms as long as boa constrictors, said their father with a grin. Whenever he finds the people who have been speaking his name, he opens up his fists and reaches out his arms, and he grithers them in. He grabs them by the head and squeezes them until their skulls pop, just like a balloon. Does he look like Bigfoot? Asked Jimbo. No, said his father. He's not like Bigfoot, and he's not like the abominable snowman either. Nobody knows what he looks like for sure. The only people who have ever seen the Grither are the people the Grither has eaten. They say he's as tall as a tree, but he can bend all the way over and touch the ground. They say his skin looks like a road map because it's transparent and all of his blue and red veins show through. The blue is for fear and the red is for the Grither's rage. Hurry up and finish the story before he gets here, Steffa cried. The Grither was born on a sailing ship, said the father. It was blown off course by a storm and got lost in the Arctic Sea. They drifted around for weeks and never saw anything but glaciers and icebergs. Some of the passengers drowned, some froze to death, some starved, and the rest, they committed suicide. The Grither was born out of the fear and rage of all those people. But why does he kill people? Jimbo asked. Nobody knows, said his father. He just doesn't like anyone telling his story or saying his name. Is that all? Steffa asked. Is that the end of the story? Not quite, said her father. There's only one way to protect yourself from the Grither. Maybe you should stop, their mother interrupted. I think you've scared them enough. Their father chuckled. You don't believe in the Grither, do you? He asked. No, the children said, which was obviously a lie. Well, you shouldn't, their father said, because I made it all up. There's no such thing as the Grither. But you didn't finish the story, Steffa whined. All of a sudden, the front door blew open, and the room was enveloped in an icy blast of wind. There was a crash and the sound of breaking glass. Then two huge, gnarled arms reached in through the windows and grabbed their parents by both of their heads. As the children watched in horror, these gigantic hands squeezed and squeezed, and then their parents' heads just popped, just like two balloons. I have seen some curious sights, and I have taken part in some equally curious affairs in the course of my career, but I can safely assert that the story I'm going to tell you now equals, if does not excel, anything I have ever known. I had just come from South America, where I had been ranching for a good number of years, and having been more successful than the majority of men who go in for that occupation, I had returned to the old country with the intention of making it my home for the remainder of my existence. If you were prepared to spend the money, it would not seem difficult to find a house of the description you require. Yet only those who have tried it know what a serious business it can be. One will be too large and without sufficient land. Another too small and with more land than you care to be bothered with. My wife and I visited innumerable places, and at last were beginning to despair at ever finding what we wanted. Then, quite by chance, I happened to hear of the property with which this story is connected. It was necessary for me to visit Plymouth in order to meet a friend who was returning from Australia. The beauty of Devon is proverbial, and never prettier than in the autumn. After my long absence abroad, it had a charm for me that I find it difficult to express in words. The dark red soil, the luxuriant hedgerows, the babbling brooks, and the vast solitude of Dartmoor appealed to me with an overwhelming force. This was the country for me, if only I could find the place for which I had been so long and warily searching. While I was awaiting the arrival of my friend's vessel, I made it my business to call on one of the leading house agents in order to make inquiries. Alas for my hopes! He had nothing on his books that I cared even to consider. I tried another, and yet a third, but with the same result. There were houses in plenty in the town, but they were useless. There were others in the immediate neighborhood, but each had some drawback. I bade the last agent good afternoon, and returned to my hotel very disappointed with my ill success. That evening my friend arrived, and in the pleasure of welcoming him, I forgot for the time being my quest of a residence. I was nearer success, however, than I had imagined. On descending to the coffee room next morning, I found a letter upon my plate. It was from the first agent upon whom I had called on the previous day. Quite by chance, he stated, he had happened to hear of an estate situated in a charming little village on the edge of the moor. The house was an old and picturesque one, and the property consisted of some 70 acres. Some slight repairs would have to be effected, and for the reason that the house had not been inhabited for some considerable time, the owner being abroad and unable to keep it up. In conclusion, it was stated that the estate would be either let on lease or sold outright. I carefully studied the particulars enclosed, and as I did so, I began to feel that it really looked as if I had discovered what I wanted. When my friend descended, I told him the news and invited him to remain a day longer in order to come out with me and inspect it. He consented to do so, and that afternoon we chartered a carriage and drove out. There are reasons why I suppressed the name of the village. They will, I expect, be obvious to you. Give a dog a bad name and hang him may apply as well to a property as to the canine race. The Hall, as the place was called, was on the further side of the village and was on the very edge of the moor. The agent had described it exactly when he had declared it to be a picturesque old building. It stood on high ground, and immediately behind it rose up the steep side of Bryn Tor, crowned with enormous boulders that gave it a strangely wild appearance. The house itself was approached by a lengthy carriage drive, and, as I learned later, had been built in the days of George I. From the first moment that I saw it, I liked it. We drew up the steps and alighted. I presented the housekeeper with the order to view, whereupon she examined it as if it were a banknote for £1,000, and she was not quite certain as to whether it was genuine. At last, however, she condescended to admit us, and we entered the large square hall. It was paved, and I must confess, did not present a very inviting appearance. The oak paneling, however, was handsome, while the grand staircase was massive and finely carved. With no very good grace, the old woman threw open the door of the room which I judged to be the dining room. Thence we proceeded on our tour of investigation. The house, with the exception of the kitchen and bedroom, was quite unfurnished and certainly stood in need of repair. It possessed, however, great possibilities, and I felt sure that when furnished and put in proper order, it would make a charming dwelling. By the time our inspection was finished, the afternoon was well advanced, and if we desired to get back to Plymouth in time for dinner, it behooved us to start at once. That evening I wrote a long description of what I had seen to my wife, inviting her to join me in order that I might have her opinion. The next day she arrived. She proved to be as charmed with it as I was, and by the end of the week following, matters were in excellent trim for my becoming its owner. As soon as the necessary legal formalities had been complied with, my wife set off for London on furniture buying thoughts intent, while I remained behind to hurry on the work that had to be completed before we could come into the residence. At last, it was the second week in November, if my memory serves me, and the furniture began to arrive. A makeshift bedroom was prepared for me, and I exchanged the hotel in Plymouth for my own abode. For the next few days, my life was not altogether a bed of roses. Everything had to be arranged. The servants were new, while the furnishers' men required strict supervision to prevent them spending the greater part of their time at the village inn. However, it was all done at last, and I felt that when my wife gave it the few finishing touches which only a woman can do, it would be as nearly perfect as a man could wish to have his home. It was on the day that my wife arrived that the first curious circumstance occurred, which is the purpose of this story to relate. We had finished dinner and were in our drawing room discussing affairs in general and wondering when the butler was going to bring in coffee. "I told him we would have it immediately after dinner," said my wife. I rang the bell and almost immediately he appeared in answer to it. He looked round the room in surprise, as if he expected to find a third person present. "We will have coffee, Simpson," said my wife. "Always let us have it as soon after dinner as possible." "You will excuse me, madam, but I thought you were engaged with a lady." "I see no lady." He looked down at her in bewilderment. "A lady came up the hall," he said, "just as you left the dining room, and I thought she came in here." I looked at the man sharply. Apparently he was sober. "You must have dreamt it," I continued. "No, sir, I am quite sure I did not. I saw her quite distinctly, and would know her again anywhere. She seemed in great trouble, so that is why I did not disturb you. I'm very sorry, sir." He departed to bring in the coffee, and when he returned, I asked him to describe the person in question more minutely. I gathered that she was tall and had a beautiful face, but with a very sad expression. She was dressed entirely in black and had what he called a black lace shawl upon her head. The man was deeply in earnest, but I could make neither head nor tail of it. "Let us look round," I said. "I'm quite sure that the hall door has not been opened since dinner, and if she is in the house now, we shall doubtless find her." Accompanied by my wife, we set off and visited all the rooms on the ground floor, not omitting the servants' hall. My wife questioned the maids, but one and all asserted that they had not been into the hall since dinner. We next tried all the rooms upstairs with the same result. Simpson's mysterious black lady, if she had existed, was certainly not in the house. I felt more than ever convinced that the man must have fallen asleep in his pantry and dreamt it. But we were not done with her yet. A week or so afterwards, and when we were quite settled in, one of the maids who had been down to the village declared that on a path that led through the shrubbery to a side gate, she had met a lady who seemed in great distress. According to the girl's story, she was wringing her hands, and it was too dark for the maid to see the woman's face. You're quite sure of what you're saying? I asked when Simpson brought the girl into presence. I am quite sure, was her reply. I held the gate open for her to pass through. Well, did she speak to you? Not a word, sir. She just went by me as if she didn't see me. This is really one of the strangest things I ever heard, I said to my wife when we were alone together. I wonder who the woman is, and by what right she trespasses on my grounds. If I meet her, I shall put the question to her. Christmas was now drawing near, and we had invited a large house party to spend the festive season with us. Among the number was a young fellow named Desborough, who had just got his troop in a Lancer regiment. We had placed him in a room in the bachelor's wing, which was the oldest portion of the house. He and I were the first two to reach the drawing room before dinner. I say, old man, he began, how many people have you got in the house? Well, I told him the number. Yes, but who was the other one? The lady with the sorrowful countenance, and a jolly pretty one at that. There is no one else, I replied. I have given you the names of all of them. Well, that's funny, for I'll swear she was no housemaid, and I've seen your wife's maid. Are you sure you're not rotting me? Perfectly sure. Describe this mysterious individual to me. Well, I'm not much of a hand at that sort of work, but I know that she was jolly good-looking, and with what looked like a lace mantilla on her head, and she seemed to be in rare trouble. She was wringing her hands and looked so sorrowfully at me, for that moment I was almost tempted to ask her what was the matter. Wait here a moment, I said. I'll run upstairs and see if I can discover who this person can be. I did so, muttering as I went that I was getting a little tired of the lady's visits to my house. But though I searched the bachelor's wing and such other rooms as I could enter, no trace of her could I discover. I returned to the drawing room and informed Desborough of my ill success. Well, you can say what you like, he answered. I saw her plainly as I can see you right now. Thus, the matter was dropped for the time being. My wife was the next to be favored with a glimpse of her. It was Christmas Eve, and the ladies had been down to the church to decorate the edifice for the next day. It was almost dark when they started to return. My wife remained behind the party for about 10 minutes to discuss certain matters with the vicar. It was snowing heavily when she left the church, and the country looked indescribably beautiful in the light of the full moon. Her version of the story is that she had just left the shrubbery and was passing along the path that ran at the foot of the terrace when she looked up and saw a woman, dressed in black, leaning with her hands upon it, looking down at her. She declares that to this day she was too surprised to be frightened, or to say or do anything. And then the woman walked away from her, wringing her hands as if she were in great grief. 3 minutes could not have elapsed before I had been told, and was out on the terrace in pursuit. I looked about, but there was no sign of her, and stranger still, there was not a footmark other than my own upon the snow. The matter was getting beyond me. I could not make head nor tail of it. The next day, after the morning service, I took the vicar aside and asked him if he could give me any clue to the mystery. I told him the matter was getting serious. The servants declared that it was a ghost, and in consequence, some were threatening to leave me. Well, I will not deny, he said, that something of this sort of thing has been village gossip for a great many years, and more than one person has laid claim to having seen it. Personally, I have never done so. The story goes that it is the spirit of a Spanish woman who was once the mistress of the house. If you will come into the church again, I will show you a tablet to her memory. I followed the vicar and discovered the inscription in question. It described her, and for reasons already stated, I will not give her name, as being the wife of the owner of the house, and also set forth the fact that she had died in the year 1782. "Well, there's not much to be gained from that," I said, "but the coincidence is, to say the least of it, singular." I then thanked him and rejoined my party. That evening was devoted to the usual amusements associated with the season. I am afraid we were all very juvenile and must have shocked the grave Simpson. We played dumb crambo, acted charades, and at last came to thought-reading. In my turn, I went out of the room while an experiment was preparing. The hall was brilliantly lighted, and I give you my word that I had no thought of the mysterious lady at that moment. Suddenly I looked up to see her passing along the corridor at the top of the great staircase in the direction of the bachelor's quarters. Seizing a hat and coat, I ran up the stairs just in time to see her turning the corner of the corridor. I set off in pursuit. She was evidently making her way to a little door that led by a flight of steps to the garden below. By the time I reached it, she had disappeared. But throwing open the door, I saw her passing swiftly along the garden path towards the shrubbery. Donning my hat and drawing on my coat, I continued my chase. She passed out of the wicket gate and turned into the narrow lane that led towards the tor. It was the night of full moon and was almost as light as day. Without leaving any track upon the snow, she sped on at such a rate that I had great difficulty in keeping her in sight. At last she reached the foot of the tor and began the ascent. This was more than I had bargained for it must be remembered that my feet were in evening dress shoes and that snow was lying inches deep upon the ground. However, having come so far, I was determined to see what the end of it all would be. Staggering and falling, I began to climb. The black figure speeding on ahead of me never paused for a moment. At last it reached the summit and stood, while perhaps I could have counted to 20 upon the topmost boulder. It made a weird picture, I can assure you of that. Then she raised her arms above her head and fell through the air to the rocks, nearly 200 feet below. On my honor, it was so real that I gave a great cry as I saw it. I scrambled down to see if there was any sign of her, but there was none. The tragedy ended with her death. I went home, scarcely able to believe the evidence of my senses. Next day I took Desborough up to the tor with me and described the scene to him. I believe he thought I had dreamt it all. We stood at the foot and looked up at it. "By Jove, it would be a ghastly place to take a leap from," he said. "Is that a cave up there?" He pointed halfway up the face of the cliff. There certainly was a cave there. "Perhaps that is the clue to the mystery," I cried. "A man could be lowered to it from the top. As soon as the snow goes, I'll have a look at it." A week later, I took several of my men and a strong rope and visited the tor once more. After having taken every possible precaution, they lowered me over the cliff till I reached the narrow entrance to the cave. I managed to squeeze myself in and then lit a candle which I had brought with me. 3 steps took me into a fair-sized cavern and showed me as strange and terrible a sight as man has ever looked upon. Stretched out upon the floor was the skeleton of a man, and scattered around him were remains of books and what once might have been a blanket. I took up one of the books, and inside the cover found the name of the man whose wife's tablet I had seen in the village church on Christmas Day. Later on, I examined it carefully. Inside was written, "I am dying of starvation. They will not let my wife bring me food. I have destroyed the papers. Farewell, my beloved wife." Thus, the mystery was solved. The poor remains were brought down from their long resting place and decently interred. And since then, the Black Lady, as the village folk call her, has not been seen. I do not pretend to account for it. I simply give you this story. Krampus is the evil demon anti-Santa, or maybe he's Santa's evil twin, who is used as a tool to encourage good behavior in children. Krampus Night, or Krampusnacht, is celebrated on December 5th, the eve of St. Nicholas Day in Austria and around other parts of Europe. Public celebrations that night have many Krampuses walking the streets, looking for people to beat. Krampus may look like a devil or a wild alpine beast, and it is said that he comes and kidnaps children who are bad. If this is the first time you're hearing of Krampus, please check into it to upgrade your Christmas cheer. Many years ago, in Ireland, there was a wealthy man who lived in a small village. He owned every single plot of land surrounding the village and rented them out to poor farmers at a tidy profit. The man lived in the biggest house in the village with his lovely wife, his 2 strong sons, and his small, sickly daughter. He was kind to all of his children and treated his wife like a queen. However, in business, he was ruthless and cunning. He made a lot of money by charging the villagers high rents and treated all of his tenants as if they were slaves. If any one of them was behind with their rent, he would throw them out of their houses without a moment's notice. The villagers hated the rich man and despised his cruel and miserly ways. He often threw lavish parties, inviting only his friends and family, and living like a king, while the poor villagers had to scrimp and save just to keep their bellies full. All they could afford was a meager diet of bread and potatoes. One year, there was a potato blight, and all of the crops were affected. As winter set in, the villagers were starving to death. The rich man paid no attention to the troubles of his tenants and responded by raising the rents. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he threw a Christmas party for his friends and family where they enjoyed an enormous feast and drank sarcastic toasts to the plight of the starving tenants. That night, one villager arrived at the door bearing a gift. He said it was a Christmas present for the rich man's daughter. The girl opened the present and found a sock puppet inside. The villager said he had knitted it himself and asked if he might have some food. In return, the rich man handed the villager one single solitary potato and sent him on his way. Although it was a hideous old rag, the daughter seemed to love the sock puppet. She named it Charlie and put it on her hand, showing it to everyone at the party. That night, after the party was over, the father was going to bed. He paused at his daughter's bedroom door and looked in on her. She was fast asleep. Just as he was about to leave, something disturbed him. The sock puppet was still on her hand, and its plastic eyes seemed to be staring straight at him. He ignored it and walked out, thinking that he was just imagining things. That night, as the rich landlord and his wife slept in their chamber, they heard a knock at the door. It was their daughter. "Mama? Papa? Charlie says he needs to speak with you," she said. They saw their daughter walk in, blood dripping from one hand and the sock puppet on the other, staring at them both. Charlie already spoke with Jacob and Michael, said the daughter, moving the sock puppet's mouth as if it was speaking. Now he must speak with you. For weeks, the rich man's house lay eerily silent. The villagers saw no candles in the windows and no smoke from the chimney. Eventually, they decided to check on the family, and what they discovered shocked them to their very core. In the living room sat the two brothers. Both strong young men had had their heads twisted off and placed on their hands as if the heads were puppets. The same had happened to the parents, who were found dead and decaying in their beds. The most disturbing sight of all was the little girl. She was sitting in the corner of the bedroom, her severed head balanced upon one hand, smiling sweetly with her eyes wide open. On the other hand was the sock puppet. Due to the rigor mortis, her arms were sticking out, and it seemed as if the two hands were speaking to each other. Just recently, a family moved into the house. They moved to the country because the family doctor said it might help their sick daughter recover from her illness. Everything was fine until one night when the mother heard the daughter calling out to her. Before the mother opened the door, she heard her daughter talking. She peeked in, and the girl was fast asleep. "What did she need, honey?" asked the father when his wife returned. The mother paused before speaking. "I have no idea," she said. "The poor little thing must have been talking in her sleep. Do you know where she got that awful sock puppet? She was wearing it on her hand, and it almost seemed like it was staring straight at me." We hope that you've been good this year. We hope that you're not on Santa's naughty list, or on any list that Krampus might have. Enjoy your holidays, everyone. Take care of yourselves. No matter what holiday you might be celebrating, we hope that you enjoy it. And we hope that you have sweet dreams.